At 83, Harrison Ford has finally spoken candidly, naming 5 colleagues from Blade Runner people who not only crossed paths with him on set, but also left behind echoes that linger in his memory. This is neither an accusation nor a grudge. Rather, it feels like a late-life confession, where a veteran star confronts the hidden scars he's long carried. And it is precisely this honesty that makes the story so moving impossible for anyone to ignore. Rutger Hauer, the name that never sat comfortably with Harrison Ford on the set of Blade Runner. He once said, "I didn't hate Rutger as a person. I hated the way he made me feel small in a film where I was supposed to be the center." It may sound selfish, but it's a deeply human truth. In acting, one person's light can easily become another's shadow. One memory stayed etched in Ford's mind. During a scene, he tried suggesting an approach to Ridley Scott. Before he could finish, Rutger cut in flatly, "This scene doesn't need anything else. Leave it to me. No shouting, no drama, just a cold declaration." Scott agreed. The scene was shot Rutger's way, and audiences later praised it. Harrison remained silent, swallowing a frustration he couldn't voice. To outsiders, it was just confidence from a Northern European actor used to creative freedom. To Ford, it was a glaring exclamation point. "Here, you are not in charge." Over time, the discomfort accumulated, never exploding, never argued out loud, just layers of silent turbulence. Until decades later, at 83, Harrison finally admitted, Rutger Hauer was the one name that unsettled him most on Blade Runner. He never denied Rutger's brilliance. In fact, he often praised him in interviews. But praise doesn't equal fondness. Ford understood the audience adored Roy Batty, yet they could never know how overshadowed he felt behind that brilliance. The bitter truth is that Rutger passed away in 2019. Harrison never spoke of these feelings while he lived. He maintained silence, the grace of a man who knew public quarrels would only tarnish the collective legacy. But in old age, looking back on a lifetime, he chose to name Rutger, not to belittle him, not to steal credit, simply to be honest with himself. "I once felt eclipsed." And that is what makes this story unforgettable. Not because Harrison Ford hated Rutger Hauer, but because after decades, he dared to name a truth that haunted him. And that truth reminds us, behind every immortal film lie hidden struggles, unspoken emotions, and confessions that only surface when the years strip everything else away. To audiences worldwide, Rutger Hauer was a true legend. He embodied Roy Batty with rare depth, ruthless yet fragile, a villain both feared and pitied. To the public, Rutger was the symbol of raw intensity, a European actor entering Hollywood with proud defiance, his piercing eyes seeming to see straight into your soul. Many hailed him as the very soul of Blade Runner, even claiming the film would never have become a masterpiece without Roy Batty. But for Harrison Ford, things weren't nearly so rosy. During their time working together, Ford admitted that Rutger's presence felt like an invisible blade hanging over his head. He respected Rutger's talent, never denied his power as an actor. But instead of inspiring him, that talent made Harrison feel diminished, as if his own light was being eclipsed. On screen, audiences saw an explosive clash, Deckard, weary and cornered, against Roy Batty, vibrant, fierce, magnetic. The final monologue, "All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain," became immortal. People wept for Rutger. They remembered his eyes. But few knew that same moment left a lasting sting in Harrison's heart. He once confided to a close friend, "Audiences saw me and Rutger as polar opposites, but on set, I didn't feel respected as a peer. I felt like nothing more than the backdrop for him to shine." Rutger Hauer was never loud, never confrontational. He didn't need to be. The way he entered a scene decisive, commanding, radiating absolute confidence was enough to silence a set. Others called it charisma. Harrison felt it as suffocation, a presence so overwhelming it left little air for anyone else. Ford was no stranger to strong co-stars. He'd acted alongside Sean Connery, Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher, names that glowed just as brightly. But Connery, with all his gravitas, Hamill with his youthful charm, even Fisher with her fire, they still gave Ford space to breathe. Rutger didn't. Every time the camera rolled, Harrison felt like he was being tested, forced to prove himself in a film that should have been his territory, centered on a character named Deckard. Behind the scenes, this dynamic grew sharper. Rutger spoke little, but every word dripped with cool certainty. He mused about philosophy, about the human condition, about how he would break apart a scene to make it his own. And he did exactly that. The final speech, never in the script, was his creation. It was beautiful, timeless. But for Harrison, it was also the final cut, slicing into the pride of a leading man used to being the axis of the story. Edward James Olmos, the silence that wore Harrison Ford down more than any confrontation ever could. He once sighed to a close confidant, "He doesn't need to say a word, and I already feel invisible." A simple line, but it revealed the quiet frustration gnawing at him. Fans might wonder, why would a man who worked with giants like Sean Connery or Tommy Lee Jones feel troubled by Edward James Olmos, an actor who wasn't even a major star back then? The answer lies in contrast. Harrison was used to directness. Colleagues who argued, who demanded, who spoke their minds. With Olmos, everything was veiled, silent, ambiguous. And that ambiguity wore him down, as though he was always guessing what the other man truly thought. At 83, looking back, Harrison finally placed Edward James Olmos among the most difficult colleagues he had on Blade Runner. Not to deny his artistry, not to smear his name. Simply to admit, sometimes two people never find a rhythm, and for Ford, Olmos was one of them. What's admirable is that, despite his discomfort, Ford never stirred public conflict. For decades he stayed silent, praised the film, respected his co-star's contribution. But in later years, he chose to name it plainly. Edward James Olmos was the one who made me feel the most pushed away. Perhaps that honesty is what makes the confession resonate, because it reminds us clashes aren't always loud. Sometimes silence itself can weigh heavier than any fight. And for Harrison Ford, Edward James Olmos was the embodiment of that silence. If Rutger Hauer was the flame burning bright on screen, then Edward James Olmos was like a cold, hidden current. He played Gaff, a man of few words, whose quiet gaze seemed always to watch and judge. Audiences loved that mystery, seeing Gaff as Deckard's silent shadow, a vessel for Ridley Scott's deeper meanings. But to Harrison Ford, that silence went far beyond the script. It became a constant source of unease behind the camera. Audiences remembered Blade Runner for its heavy monologues and philosophical lines. But Olmos's Gaff stood apart, speaking little, sometimes in a strange street language he invented himself. Many praised this creativity, saying it made the character unique and alive. Harrison, however, only felt cornered. His scene partner barely spoke, yet every glance, every odd word, seemed to cast a shadow over Deckard. Ford later recalled how Olmos rarely opened up on set. He was polite, but distant. Every time they shared a scene, Edward built an invisible wall. Not open disdain, not rudeness, just a distance so thick it left Ford feeling excluded. To him, it was like talking to a walking statue. He tried to connect, but got only half smiles and unreadable stares in return. What wore Harrison down most was Olmos's extreme method approach. When the cameras stopped, most actors would relax, drop their characters, share a laugh. Olmos didn't. He kept the enigmatic face, kept speaking his invented language, kept moving slowly, as if still performing. For Ford, an actor who thrived on natural rhythm, it was like a tightening vice. He couldn't tell where the character ended and the man began. Once, during an outdoor shoot, Harrison tried to lighten the mood. Curious, he asked how Olmos had come up with that bizarre street dialect. He expected a collegial chat. Instead, Olmos shut him down cold. "That's my business." Then he turned away, scribbling notes in his little book. To Ford, it wasn't just a brush-off. It felt like a slap, a message. You don't need to know. "It's not your concern." Moments like that repeated. No blow-ups, no fights, just layer after layer of icy distance. Others might have called it professionalism, dedication, but to Harrison, it was alienating, a kind of coldness more exhausting than any heated argument. The irony was, on screen, that very coldness worked brilliantly. Gaff only appeared for minutes, yet lingered in the audience's mind. Especially in the final scene, leaving behind the origami unicorn, viewers applauded the subtlety. They praised Olmos for turning a minor role into a symbol. Meanwhile, Harrison felt the weight. "I'm the lead, but people remember the man who barely speaks." Ford always acknowledged the value of his co-stars. He never denied that Blade Runner's magic partly came from Olmos's choices. But the truth remained in practice. Those very choices built a wall between them. It was a wall Harrison both admired and resented, wanting to reach across, yet constantly pushed back. Sean Young, the fragile beauty Harrison Ford never found easy to embrace. For decades, Ford kept silent. He never attacked Sean in public, never fed the press. But in his 80s, he finally named what he once avoided. Sean Young was among the colleagues he found hardest to work with on Blade Runner. Audiences needn't take sides. The truth is, both helped create one of cinema's most enduring romances. Without Sean, Blade Runner would have lost half its soul. Without Harrison, Deckard would not have become an icon. The discomfort, he confessed, was simply the shadow side of a pairing too different in generation, experience, and temperament. And perhaps that is why, at 83, he had no qualms about naming Sean, not to diminish her, but to be honest. Honest that some relationships are both beautiful and difficult, memorable yet scarred. And sometimes, it is precisely these contradictions that give art its deepest resonance. Among Harrison Ford's colleagues on Blade Runner, Sean Young was perhaps the most controversial name. To the public, she was an icon of 1,980 seconds, allure, thick, dark hair, mysterious eyes, and a cool elegance reminiscent of Hollywood's golden age. As Rachel, she became one of science fiction's most unforgettable female figures. Innocent, yet fragile, carrying a metaphysical sadness about existence itself. And yet, behind the shimmering image, Harrison carried an experience that was far less pleasant. He never denied Sean's beauty or magnetism. On set, she seemed born to be Rachel. Every glance, every line drew the audience in. But for Harrison, the difficulty lay not in the role, but in Sean's approach. Inexperienced, stubborn, and often lacking the subtlety that allows two actors to truly sync. Ford openly admitted that working with Sean was heavy-going. Not because she lacked talent, but because her inexperience often made things awkward. He was used to seasoned colleagues who could balance the flow of a scene. Sean, barely in her 20s, hadn't yet found that rhythm. She often overexerted herself trying to prove her worth, and that effort itself became exhausting for him. One memory he never forgot was the famous kiss between Deckard and Rachel. On screen, audiences saw a scene of passion and intensity, love and control colliding. But behind the camera, for Harrison, it felt like a nightmare. Sean was visibly nervous, sometimes hesitant, sometimes overcompensating. Ridley Scott wanted the moment raw, tense, almost like resistance giving way to surrender. The pressure on set was stifling. For Harrison, a man who disliked noise and confrontation, it felt less like acting and more like being trapped in genuine tension. Years later, when asked about the scene, he only sighed. "It wasn't romantic at all. It was heavy, and I'd rather not remember it." A soft-spoken answer, but one that revealed the depth of his unease. Sean's youth came with illusions. She believed Blade Runner would catapult her into A-list stardom. That belief sometimes translated into rashness, how she spoke to Ridley, how she carried herself with colleagues. Harrison, already mature and seasoned, saw it as a burden. He disliked what he perceived as her delusions, disliked the sense of carrying extra weight beyond the craft itself. To him, she was both a co-star and a quiet strain. The irony, of course, was that this very immaturity gave Rachel her unique power. Audiences saw an artificial woman, uncertain of herself, trembling between fear and longing. Sean's performance carried that fragility so real it couldn't have been faked. If she had been more polished, Rachel might never have been so haunting. But for Harrison, that rawness came hand in hand with a backstage experience that was anything but easy. Daryl Hannah, the storm of rebellion that never let Harrison Ford find peace on set. And yet, the paradox is clear. That same chaos was what made Pris unforgettable. Written as a killing machine, Hannah turned her into something far stranger, half animal, half human, both alluring and terrifying. Her death scene, the shrieking, the convulsions, remains one of Blade Runner's most haunting images. Viewers were transfixed. Ford was simply relieved. It was over without further injury. At 83, when asked about the most difficult colleagues on Blade Runner, Ford didn't hesitate to name Daryl Hannah. Not to tear her down, nor to deny her talent. Simply to be honest, working with Daryl was like living through a storm. It could create beauty, but it could also wipe everything away. And perhaps that is why, even now, he still can't hide his unease when recalling it. Yet at the same time, he can't deny that without Hannah, Blade Runner would have lost half its pulse. That storm, chaotic as it was, helped turn the film into legend. Ford's frustration, in the end, was simply the shadow side of an undeniable truth. Sometimes, chaos is the perfect piece of art. In the memories of many viewers, Daryl Hannah will always be Pris, the combat doll of Blade Runner. With her platinum blonde hair, piercing eyes, and wildcat presence, she created one of the most unforgettable female characters in sci-fi history. People remember the violent flips, the sudden attacks, and the haunting death in Deckard's arms. But for Harrison Ford, behind all that drama, Hannah was a storm, a rebellious force that never allowed him a moment of ease. Unlike Sean Young, who carried the naive awkwardness of youth, Hannah radiated a brash, defiant energy from the moment she stepped on set. She made no attempt to hide her hunger to prove herself, nor did she shy away from standing toe-to-toe with seasoned veterans. Bold to the point of stubbornness, she constantly tried to mold Pris into her own creation. And yes, she succeeded. Audiences loved the ferocity she brought. But for Ford, that success came at the cost of chaos behind the camera. He recalled how Hannah had a habit of experimenting while the cameras were rolling. The script might dictate one thing, Ridley Scott's direction another, but Hannah often broke free of both. She'd shout unexpectedly, change movements on the fly, or shift her entire approach mid-scene. For Ford, a man who valued structure and discipline, this was a nightmare. He constantly felt forced to adapt, instead of being able to focus on his own performance. One memory stuck with him more than others: the brutal fight scene between Deckard and Pre. It was one of the most dangerous sequences of the film, requiring absolute precision. Yet Hannah, following her instinct for chaos, kept adding unplanned moves. At one point, she hurled a kick so unexpectedly that Ford nearly cracked his head on the floor. He was furious, but Hannah only laughed. That's what makes it real. For her, it was creativity. For him, it was recklessness, a lack of respect for her scene partner. The tension wasn't limited to action. Off-camera, Hannah carried the same disruptive energy. She openly challenged Ridley Scott's decisions, argued her way through discussions, and even cut across Ford in crew meetings. Not out of spite, but as if to declare, "I matter just as much as you do." For the reserved, Private Harrison, this bluntness was like being caught in a whirlwind. What frustrated him even more was how the public embraced her. Critics praised her courage, her boldness, her willingness to take risks. Few recognized that this very boldness often left her colleagues drained. As Ford once sighed, she always wanted everything to be rawer, stronger, more intense. But sometimes, that kind of truth came at someone else's expense. Decades later, Ford still remembers feeling overwhelmed by Hannah, not because she was stronger, but because she was too much fire, too much energy. He once compared it to standing beside a fireworks display. Dazzling, beautiful, but never safe. Joanna Cassidy, the gentle presence overshadowed by Blade Runner's noise. At 83, when Ford named Joanna Cassidy among the 5 colleagues he least enjoyed in Blade Runner, it wasn't resentment, it was regret. He admitted that her quietness and gentleness were swallowed up by the noise of the industry. Some scream to be heard, some fight to be remembered. Joanna didn't. She just stepped in, shone silently, and disappeared. And that silence still makes me uneasy. The irony is that modern audiences, looking back, often praise Cassidy with a late recognition. They call Zora's death a tragic symbol of the cyberpunk era. They celebrate her eyes, her desperate run, her fragility as a hunted soul. Everything Ford once feared, that Joanna would be forgotten, turned out not to be true. She lives on in memory, like a hidden gem beneath the dust of time. And deep down, Ford knows, without Joanna Cassidy, Blade Runner would never have been complete. Zora may have lived only minutes on screen, but those minutes carved a lasting truth. Sometimes, the quietest roles and the gentlest people leave the deepest mark on the heart. When audiences think of Blade Runner, they usually recall Harrison Ford's stoic Deckard, Sean Young's mysterious gaze, Daryl Hannah's rebellious fire, or Rutger Hauer's brooding intensity. Yet among those names, there was one woman who stayed quiet, unassuming, but left a subtle mark for those who paid attention. Joanna Cassidy, who played Zora. Zora didn't appear much. Her role was small, yet the moment she ran through acid rain, hunted down and crashing through sheets of glass, became one of the most iconic images of 1980 seconds cinema. A death both fragile and violent, hauntingly beautiful and suffocatingly brutal. That sequence, though only minutes long, has never been forgotten. Behind the camera, however, Cassidy never received the recognition she deserved. Harrison Ford once admitted that her calm professionalism almost made her invisible to the crew. In an environment fueled by egos and competition, Cassidy simply focused on her work. She didn't argue with Ridley Scott, didn't take reckless risks, didn't fight for the spotlight. She quietly became Zora, and quietly stepped away when her part was done. For Ford, this was a paradox. He valued discipline and reliability, yet Cassidy's very steadiness made her fade into the background next to louder, flashier colleagues. He once admitted, with a hint of bitterness, Joanna was one of the easiest to work with, but also one of the least remembered. And that bothers me. That frustration wasn't with Cassidy herself, but with Hollywood's indifference to people like her. Ford understood that in the brutal machine of filmmaking, noise often mattered more than talent. Sean Young's stubbornness, Hannah's wild energy, Hauer's dark charisma, they all drew attention. Cassidy, who was always prepared, professional, and never caused trouble, was pushed aside as if she were just a spare piece. What haunted Ford most was Zora's death scene. The original theatrical cut shortened it, making her exit feel rushed, even careless. Only later, in the director's cut and final cut, did Ridley Scott restore it, allowing viewers to fully see Cassidy's pain and haunting presence. Ford reflected, "It was one of the most honest performances in the film, but it was overlooked for years. Joanna deserved far more." But Cassidy never complained. She didn't demand fairness or fight for attention. She accepted it all with rare grace. When asked about Zora, she simply smiled. "I'm just glad people still remember her, even for a moment." That humility both moved and frustrated Ford. Moved because she was one of the few who never got lost in ego. Frustrated because Hollywood, and even himself, failed to shield her light from being overshadowed. Few know this. Years later, when Ridley Scott revisited the film, Cassidy volunteered to help reshoot and update Zora's death with CGI. She asked for no big fee, no conditions. She only wanted Zora to be shown properly. For Ford, That act summed up who she was, an artist who always put the work above herself. Thank you for staying with me through today's story. At 83, Harrison Ford no longer keeps to himself the mix of joy and pain from behind the scenes of Blade Runner. Perhaps these aren't complaints, but simply his way of finding peace in his soul. If this story has touched you in any way, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your support and companionship are the greatest motivation for this channel.